It's great storytelling. I hope we all agree. The art is exquisite, and clearly there's a common approach that we find with the tragedians here with the story of Croesus. Danilo is the one who selected this passage. I think it's just excellent. What we want to think about with Herodotus is that he's part of this whole Ionian Enlightenment. He was born, near the great eruption of philosophy in Miletus with Thales. We know that story about the eclipse that Thales predicted from the histories here. We would be very lost with Athenian history without Herodotus. The story of Croesus would put us in 560 around to 546 BC. This is written maybe in the 430s, so he could have had from a chain of witnesses back to Croesus. We kind of know the phrase sometimes. I don't know how many know when you say someone as rich as Croesus, right? It's remarkable that this man's name is still on our tongues sometimes, and it's a very powerful cautionary tale, of course, about the jealousy of the gods and how too much happiness or luck or good fortune will draw down the nemesis of divinity. That's a very tough worldview. We definitely want to think about why someone would think that to be the case. We also want to think about how Herodotus is showing, holding up a mirror to Athenians. He had spent a few years, it seems, in the years of Pericles. And again, I think it's very plausible, this thought that he was friends with Sophocles. If he's giving the history of the Greco-Persian Wars as the Peloponnesian War clouds were gathering and after it had begun, it's inevitable that one would have to think, well, what lessons are Athenians and other Greeks supposed to learn when they hear this work, which clearly wouldn't have been performed the same way Homeric poetry would have been, but it probably was read out in public performances. People would have sat there it's a very long book. Even if you read through one scroll, this would be many hours. Why would Athenians want to listen to such a thing? Part of it is that public performances were there, including the tragedies and the comedies, going to philosophers and the sophists, listening to the long speeches of sophists too. Was to get training for the public assembly and to learn how to listen to long and intricate arguments and to be able to make them in turn, or even more informally in the agora to participate in public deliberation even outside of the assembly. This life of conversation is something that was being filled with the ferment of the new philosophical spirit, the new dramatic spirit, and the new historical spirit. Does that improve the quality of human intelligence, human deliberation, conversation? And what do we get when we read a story like this? Does it seem to us like history? Does it seem too pat? Or does it give us insight into the life we've already lived and to the ways that we might live together? I think these are very serious questions. At the very beginning of the work, we have the logos of woman stealing is how the work begins. It's the way that Herodotus accounts for the deep roots of the enmity between Asia and Europe, as he calls it. For Herodotus, there were three continents, Asia, Europe, and Libya. This war between Persia and the Greek-speaking city-states clearly is meant to be another chapter in the story that we know from Homer and the Iliad. Again, that's going to be more problematic when we look at Virgil and say, well, what's west, what's east? If the founding of the city of Rome, the greatest state of the West, has its roots in the Asian city of Troy, it's very fluid, it seems to me. But Herodotus wants to set this history up in terms of this antagonism between Europe and Asia. A little tricky because, of course, already in the archaic, in the Dark Ages, and then with renewed vigor in the Archaic Ages. The Archaic Age, the Greek city-states had sent out colonists all over the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and of course, settling the western coast of Asia Minor. So it's not as if Europe, quote unquote, was keeping to itself, right? It had made quite a foothold in Asia. But the logos that begins these histories it's kind of subtle, because Herodotus is saying, this is the Persian account of how women got abducted from each side. And what needs to be noted is that the story of Io and Europa, as told supposedly by the Persians, has nothing of the mythological grandeur that we know from, the story of the Europa being turned into a heifer and all of that, where Zeus was involved. There's no mention of Zeus here, right? It's a matter now of a merchant, a Phoenician merchant stealing Io and so on. And then the abduction of Medea, no mention of the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece, right? That's the story that it's from. And then we have the abduction of Helen as part of this. So what's Herodotus doing? That's one of the things we want to think about. Is he demythologizing these stories? Is he saying the Persians are too rationalistic? That's one thing. And also it indicates that the sexual politics, the only names we're getting at the beginning are the names of the women who are being taken. And then we get the thing where the Persians say, well, why are you invading Troy for the sake of a woman, right? It doesn't make any sense. And that's interesting. But on both sides, what we have is an account of, it's a personalizing of history, where what's going on is that there's a personal grievance, as opposed to, say, thinking about the Trojan War as probably about trade routes and control of trade, right? Is history about great persons and their motives and their grievances, or is it about structural factors, or is it about both, right? And then it goes right into Croesus as the first one who started aggression against the Greeks. So he's brought into the story as a precursor to the Persian aggression, as being an Asian potentate who first made the Ionian Greeks pay tribute. So that's the story. And then we have the great confrontation of Solon. People don't like to take that as having happened. I like to think it happened, and it could have happened. It wouldn't have happened in the way that Herodotus said, because Solon's reforms of Athens happened in the early 6th century, and Croesus would have been ruler around 560. So Solon would have had to meet him earlier than that. But there we have Athenian wisdom confronting Asian pride, or whatever that's supposed to be, or maybe not, right? Maybe it's just the fact that Solon is a wise man, and we all need to try to become more Delphic, and that's the kind of wisdom that we're going to see with Socrates too next week. The Delphic injunctions to know thyself and nothing in excess, right? Those are the great maxims of wisdom. These are some thoughts to have in our heads. I could go into the history of the reforms that Solon had done and all that, but I think we'll probably have chance to do that with when we get to Alcibiades, actually, because his history is rooted in his family, which goes all the way back to the 6th century in terms of the records.
So question 1, how does Herodotus synthesize the poetic myth of Homer with the logos of philosophers in his storytelling? How does he balance the mystical with the logical? Question number 2, in what ways is Herodotus's histories like and unlike modern historiography? Can you identify strengths and weaknesses in the two approaches, one based on oral storytelling and the other more journalistically or scientifically skeptical? 3, how do fate, providence, and human freedom play out in the story of Croesus? Number 4, what do you think of Solon's estimation of human happiness?